What if I told you that Ferrari could have unknowingly compromised Lewis Hamilton's future in Formula One? What Frédéric Vasseur discovered in Hamilton's car after the Singapore GP has not only set off alarms within the paddock, it has unearthed an internal flaw in Maranello that could cost them the championship. Stay, because I'm going to tell you how a simple technical failure can become a nuclear bomb for Ferrari. What began as a seemingly isolated incident at the Singapore Grand Prix turned, within hours, into one of the biggest technical crises Ferrari has faced in recent years. It all started after the checkered flag. While most teams were focusing their attention on the usual post-race analysis, in Maranello the atmosphere was radically different. Ferrari team boss Frédéric Vasseur was not only dissatisfied with Hamilton's performance during the race, but ordered an immediate technical review of the SF25. What he found, according to internal sources, was not a simple anomaly, but a systemic failure that shook the foundations of the 2025 project. During the first hours after the race, the engineering team activated a full analysis protocol on car number 44. What initially seemed like a one-time problem in the brake system ended up revealing a pattern of failures accumulated over time. The brake-by-wire system, key to the integration of hydraulic braking with energy recovery of the MGUK, had operated on the verge of thermal collapse throughout the weekend, reaching temperatures never recorded in Ferrari's recent history. Telemetry not only confirmed this data, the behavioral patterns were eerily similar to small anomalies detected in previous races, but never fully investigated. And here the first big question is revealed. How is it possible that a team like Ferrari, with decades of experience and a multi-million-dollar budget, has overlooked a technical failure that had been accumulating since the beginning of the season? Vasseur was not only surprised, but visibly enraged. Not because of the failure itself, but because of the apparent complacency within the technical department. The car's thermal management had been compromised since the first tests in Bahrain, and yet the SF25 continued to be developed on a faulty basis. The most alarming thing about the case is not the technical failure, but what it implies: a structural error in the design approach. The decisions that led to this configuration of the car were not improvised. They were the product of months of planning, simulations in wind tunnels, aerodynamic calculations, and validations by a technical team that, in theory, should anticipate these risks. How did they go unnoticed? Leaked images from the garage over the weekend show a tense atmosphere even before the race. Engineers arguing with tablets in hand, last-minute adjustments in the brake area, and a visibly upset Vasseur watching from the background. The most worrying hypothesis is that Ferrari could have been aware of the problem for weeks, but chose to ignore it in the hope that it would not manifest itself in a critical way. But Singapore, with its closed layout, high humidity, reduced speeds, and constant demands on the braking system, exposed the weaknesses of the SF25 mercilessly. The lack of natural ventilation, together with a cooling system compromised by aerodynamic decisions, was the perfect cocktail for a technical catastrophe. This discovery not only leaves the engineering department in doubt, but also poses an existential threat to the Hamilton-Ferrari project. The promise of building a winning car, capable of returning the Scuderia to the top, is now faltering in the face of evidence of poor structural planning. And the most delicate thing is that this revelation comes too early in the season to hide it or correct it without consequences. All of this raises a central question for Ferrari: how to rebuild internal and external trust after a failure of this magnitude. And how to convince a driver of Lewis Hamilton's stature that this mistake does not represent the true potential of the Scuderia. This is, without a doubt, a storm that is just beginning for Maranello. The SF25 was presented as the car that would mark the definitive rebirth of Ferrari in the new era of Formula One. The team had dedicated an enormous amount of technical, human, and strategic resources to perfecting a concept that promised performance, efficiency, and reliability. But the truth is that, in its attempt to close the gap with McLaren and Red Bull, Ferrari crossed a fine line between innovation and miscalculated risk. And what Frédéric Vasseur discovered after the Singapore Grand Prix made it clear that this line was surpassed from the initial design stage. The heart of the problem lies in a critical combination of technical decisions, where aerodynamics and the cooling system entered into an unresolved conflict. For 2025, Ferrari has introduced a new pull rod front suspension, seeking to replicate some of the success Red Bull had with that architecture. The idea was to free up aerodynamic space under the chassis to improve airflow to the flat bottom and diffuser. This, in theory, should increase downforce without penalizing the car's efficiency. But there was a hidden cost. That same modification reduced the margins of physical space available for the braking system components and, even more seriously, for the cooling system. With less space to integrate efficient ventilation ducts, The front brakes and the energy recovery module MGUK began to operate in an increasingly narrow thermal range. This condition not only made the car more susceptible to overheating problems on street circuits like Singapore, but also severely limited the ideal operating window for the brake-by-wire system, one of the car's most delicate and technologically advanced components. What should have been a balanced car instead became a vehicle prone to failure under extreme conditions. The most disconcerting thing about the case is that this defect was not something that appeared suddenly. Internal simulations, wind tunnel data, and pre-season testing were already showing worrying signs. Records from the first races of the season had revealed anomalous thermal behavior, but this was downplayed. Even at the Australian Grand Prix, the temperature peaks in the brakes were already close to the tolerance limits. However, the SF25 design was considered competitive enough to continue without structural modifications. This was one of the most costly decisions of the Vasseur era. The choice to compromise cooling in favor of aerodynamic performance reflected an all-or-nothing mentality, perhaps driven by the urgent need to achieve results in an extremely competitive environment. But that choice ended up revealing a fundamental weakness in Ferrari's approach: its obsession with copying successful concepts without fully adapting them to its own technical philosophy. The SF25 was not born as an evolution of the SF24, but as an overly aggressive reinterpretation of the solutions seen in other equipment. And that disconnection between external innovation and internal integration has been, precisely, its biggest Achilles heel. This situation has forced Vasseur to completely reopen the SF25 technical dossier. The post-Singapore analysis revealed a series of cascading failures that not only affect the car's current performance, but seriously compromise its future development. Any attempt at a deep redesign in the middle of the season would mean penalties in time, resources, and perhaps results, and that puts even more pressure on a team already under scrutiny. To understand the magnitude of the psychological blow that this technical failure represents, we must consider the context in which Hamilton joined the team. After 2 difficult seasons at Mercedes, with a car unable to fight for consistent victories and a technical structure in constant restructuring, Ferrari offered him an emotional outlet. A new challenge, the possibility of returning a historic team to the top, and the promise of having a competitive car from the start. That was the narrative. But the post-Singapore reality paints a very different story. Sources close to the driver say that Hamilton felt betrayed by what happened. Not because the car failed as part of the sport, but because the failure exposed a series of internal negligence that had not been communicated to him. But here another obstacle arises: internal morality. What happened in Singapore has left a deep psychological scar. And a team that doubts itself, that questions its own technical decisions, loses vital fractions of a second in the execution of critical tasks. The pressure is no longer just external. It is internal, and affects everyone from the track engineers to the strategists and factory managers. Vasseur, as team leader, has the titanic responsibility of rebuilding cohesion without allowing fear to establish itself as a culture. Your leadership will be decisive. And to achieve this, you need short-term results. Without major points in the next 3 races, the narrative of failure could take hold, and that would be lethal. In this context, there are those who maintain that Ferrari's priority should simply be to limit damage in 2025 and focus its efforts on the 2026 car, which will be born under new technical regulations. But that strategy, although tempting, means giving up a season that began with very high expectations, with Hamilton as a star signing and with a renewed promise to fight for titles. And if Ferrari takes a conservative approach, it risks further eroding the confidence of its new driver, losing the momentum gained in 2024, and sending the wrong message to both its rivals and its own workers. This episode has not only exposed flaws in the design of the SF25, it has revealed profound weaknesses in Ferrari's decision-making process, in the coordination of its technical structure, and in its ability to respond with agility when the system is challenged. Even more worrying is the fracture of trust that could be brewing between the driver and the team management. Because in modern Formula One, technology makes a difference, yes, but it is human relationships, communication, and team culture that determine whether a structure can sustain itself when everything shakes. And that is the real question we should ask ourselves now. What kind of Ferrari is this? One that repeats the mistakes of the past and crumbles at the first shock of reality? Or one who has learned from his previous falls and is able to rebuild himself with more intelligence, more humility, and more commitment to excellence? What do you think? Do you think Hamilton made a mistake by joining the Scuderia? Do you think Vasseur has the nerve to lead this transformation from within? Or do you think the problem is deeper, that Ferrari needs a cultural revolution and not just a technical one? Leave it in the comments.